Hello everybody. It's some stuff that I wants to read. Um, it's called Mything Out on Jesus and His Teachings, like myth. Okay, the first one is myth number two. Um, being a believer is all it takes. And believe me, I'm gonna have questions after this as well. I'm gonna read all of this, and then I'm gonna have questions after this. And the questions are pretty interesting, so I'm not gonna tell you what the questions are. So excuse me, myth number two: being a believer is all it takes. Before getting into this myth, I want to make it clear that I am well aware that many of you reading and listening to this series may not be Christians or from a Christian cultural background. The reason I feel I must examine several of these Christian terms is that I want to separate them from Jesus. So many of these terms are like binoculars on a ship and must be removed, or they are add-ons to Jesus that dilute who is and what he intended. Most of my life I have brought into the importance of being a believer, or more specifically, a believer in Jesus. For years, I have emphasized the term believer over Christian, thinking this was the first identity to use that separates a person from the religious form of Christianity. If you perform a quick overview of the five Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts, you will discover that, with few exceptions, John is the only one who uses the term believe extensively. The damage that is done by relying on being a believer is a subtle but lethal. First, I have come to understand that this heavy emphasis upon being a believer is not sufficient to describe what Jesus wants from his disciples. Jesus demands more than this, as I'll demonstrate in a couple of minutes. Second, getting good already? All right. Second, being a believer becomes a threshold experience, the very doorway into salvation that Christians rely upon after sharing a time of counseling and a separate man in the psychic ward of local hospital. I told this particular study group that it was so exciting to see the man's attitude of fear change into a sincere speaking for God. One of our group members quickly said, "So he became a believer." In other words, did you close the spiritual deal and now this non-believer is a believer? We seem to want this magical moment that a person becomes a believer and then all will all will be okay. Third, remembering the day you became a believer, your threshold experience of salvation becomes a sure sign, and your faith is genuine, and not being able to nail down that date means that maybe you never actually have come into a salvation experience at all. Wow. This too can be a damaging experience. Recently, a pastor told one of his elders that if you can't identify that specific time of salvation, faith in your life, then you are probably not a genuine believer. Wow. That night,